Thank you so much, Henry, for this wonderful introduction and for the invitation. And I'm very grateful to the entire Petrarch program on Ukraine. And I'm very grateful to Papani Oksana and Papan Mykola for kindly agreeing to be discussants for this presentation. And I will try to be brief. So this is the book. It was published on February 2025 by Pelbert Macmillan, and the book focuses on the ways how we can speak about Ukrainian culture and Russian colonialism, and it attempts to develop a new methodological proposal in order to describe the particular relationship between colonial relationship between Ukraine and Russia. So I will start my presentation with a PowerPoint, and I think it will take around 20 minutes. And then I look forward to the discussants' comments and to an extended discussion of this book. Okay. I would like to begin by explaining why I felt that this book became urgent after the onset of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. This book focuses on the questions of colonialism and decolonization and reveals the need to profoundly rethink both Ukraine's colonial past and Russia's present neocolonial efforts. This book offers one modest contribution to establishing a post and decolonial frameworks in Ukraine, which have been scarce or nearly absent for a long time, at least in English language literature. Its scope shows that Ukraine's struggle doesn't just dismantle colonialism, it also challenges a global order that pretends that colonialism is over. So this book, in order to present this proposal, this book addresses the necessity of analyzing. First of all, colonialism, which for decades remained omitted from public discussion, which is Russian colonialism. Second, colonialism, which currently experiences an anachronic reenactment in an age when empires of the world have fallen. And third, colonialism, which uses a variety of discursive methods to cover its oppressive intentions. And this is a very particular aspect to discuss when we speak about Russia and its colonial rhetorics. So this task of discussion of these three aspects requires a methodology that would integrate the particular complex colonial relationship. Not only is the relationship between Ukraine and Russia unique due to its specific characteristics, such as coexistence along the shared border, the profound colonialism phase, or the historical colonialism throughout the centuries, followed by its superficial reenactment in the ongoing neo-colonial war, and particularly the ongoing violent condition of the war. It is also specific to the global time frame in which it is set, as it presents explicit anti-colonial resistance and simultaneous decolonial release in a profoundly post-colonial world. That is why Ukrainian case is so important to look at and to analyze further, because it sets a very important precedent of positioning of this anti-colonial resistance and decolonial release in contemporary world. So before moving to theory, I would like to show this wonderful endorsement by Slavoj Žižek, which was originally written by him for the forthcoming Spanish edition of this book, which I plan to publish in Mexico, in order also to establish the dialogue with Latin American countries. And he highlights in this endorsement this precise focus on colonialism that this book brings forward. I'm also very grateful to Professor Serhiy Plokhy for his kind words about the book and all the rich materials and historical materials from his works and his published books that I refer to in the chapter. The historical materials created this kind of historical dimension, the historical basis of this particular book. And also I highly appreciate the feedback of art historian Katarzyna Murawska-Mutezius for acknowledging this book's contribution to the field of art and cultural history. And this is something that I aimed for, being an art historian, to make a contribution not to one but to two fields: one field of post-colonial studies, and another field of art history. So the book attempts to balance the theoretical proposal with case studies and with a wider discussion of historical context. So when writing the book, my main preoccupation was to correctly reflect all the nuances and complexities of the centuries-long entanglement between Russia and Ukraine, and the reasons for Russian neocolonialism. The book explores how these tensions, fostered by the traumatic history and carrying the weight of contested memory, as well as divergent visions of the future, resulted in the violent outburst of neocolonial desire, beginning with the onset of Russia's war against Ukraine in 2014. In search of possible ways of discussing this topic, the theory presented in the book employs and goes beyond both post-colonial theory, developed by scholars from Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Eastern Europe, and decolonial theory, particularly that variation of it employed by scholars from Latin America. This book also offers a typology of decolonization processes that is linked to their particular historical stage after the independence of Ukraine in 1991, which can be identified in terms of their belonging either to the post-colonial condition rooted in the rethinking of the past, or the decolonial situation, which manifests breaking with the colonial historical trauma and the beginning of truly independent production of knowledge. In the book, you will see analysis. You will see examples from Ukrainian artists, but I also include examples from related to Russian culture, which I will not. The case studies I'm not going to discuss in this presentation because of the short time framework, but I encourage you to have a look at the examples directly in the book. So Russia's neocolonial war on Ukraine and Ukraine's relentless anti-colonial resistance to it and simultaneous decolonial movement marks the necessity to theoretically develop and comprehend the ongoing processes of dissolution of what I call ambicoloniality, as strong and destructive as a strong and destructive affective entanglement that goes twofold. And I will give a more detailed definition of this proposal later in the presentation. The resulting ambicolonial theory relies on the logic of the colonizer's dependence on the colonized as the primary source of the neocolonial void of power. The powerlessness of the former metropolis and the attempts to hold on to past achievements through prolonged appropriation and self-deceptive affective rhetoric, which mark both ownership and belonging at the same time, in turn lead to the outbreak of violence. Hannah Arendt, in her book on violence, observed that violence is the direct opposite of power, and that's something that I refer to in my introduction and further in the book. So, if the violence is the direct opposite of power, it fills the void left by powerlessness. Russia's neocolonialism embodies this powerlessness, violent and atrocious, yet hollow at its core. To disguise emptiness, it assumes different masks. At times playing the victim to deceive both its own society and external audiences, at others posturing the superpower, an illusion that collapses on closer inspection. The book proposes that ambicoloniality is the underlying cause of the colonizer's attempts to fill the void in the structure of power, and as it requires a foundation that would stabilize the neocolonial attempts and give substance to them. This grounding is based on symbolical adherence fueled by propaganda rather than the real state of things. Russia fights Ukraine as if it can rewrite history by force, but in this very war, it reveals the emptiness of its own power. Violence becomes not strength, but a spectacle of the colonizer haunted by the largely invented image of the colonized. So my theory relies on the preceding explorations within the postcolonial field by Ukrainian scholars such as Tamara Gundarova, Marko Pavlyshin, Mykola Repchuk, Miroslav Shkandry, and Vitaly Chernetsky, among many others, who at different times addressed from the point of view of different disciplines this particular post-colonial positioning of Ukraine. And in this way, my work contributes to the continuity of the post-colonial thought in Ukraine, while bringing in a new methodological proposal and reframing this work within an expanded globalized perspective. And there is this particular contradiction with what I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, that there was not sufficient focus on colonialism from scholarly studies. The Ukrainian postcolonial studies have a body of texts that address the topic and addressed it throughout the 30 years or more of independence. But somehow they didn't receive visibility, especially in English-speaking world, the visibility that they deserved. Now the situation is changing dramatically, and we see that the postcolonial studies and the colonial thinking in Ukraine is expanding. In an effort to build a coherent picture, the Ambicolonial theory coins not one new notion, but examines such concepts as syncretic polarization, internal hybridity, and decolonial release, among others. And this is something that I just mentioned here, but further I will address briefly these concepts. So the structure of the book addresses a variety of topics and navigates across theories from the postcolonial and decolonial approaches to selected works of post-structuralism and psychoanalytical frameworks. It is divided into 6 chapters: anti-colonialism versus self-colonization, ambicoloniality, a revolution of identity, war, desire, and ruinary reconstruction, organized both thematically and chronologically. In these chapters, I discuss topics from anti-colonial resistance and self-colonization as a starting point for my theory. And in the definition of self-colonization, I refer to the Bulgarian scholar Alexander Kiosev and his very particular vision of notion of self-colonization as when one country looks at another country to the political domain of which it doesn't belong, but tries to adjust its own culture and society to the values of this other country. So he has this very particular definition, which doesn't coincide with what many scholars of postcolonial studies use as self-colonization. So I discuss these topics and I develop further to the elements and logic of ambicoloniality and the colonial desire in the Ukrainian-Russian context. In doing so, I address a series of events that underpin the manifestation of Russian neocolonialism. From the events preceding the Euromaidan revolution to the beginning of the war and to the onset of the full-scale invasion. So, what is ambicoloniality? My book introduces the notion of ambicoloniality as a particular dynamics of the centuries-long twofold exchange of cultural and symbolic influences characteristic of Russian colonialism in Ukraine. It speaks about the current situation when Ukraine has become Russia's territory of obsession, and Russia, in its desire to occupy Ukraine, has in effect subjected itself to Ukraine's symbolic dominance. It examines how ambicoloniality can be addressed from a broader cultural framework that takes into account, first of all, cultural proximity and the institutional and infrastructural network supportive of this proximity, and the shared geographical and political borders between the two countries. The war seen by Russia as a struggle for power is considered in my approach as a part of a wider process of ambicolonial development, in which the invaders become subjects to their own colonial behavior and propaganda, losing control over reality. Ambicoloniality filters mutually important influences across the shared border. It draws on postcolonial ideas of hybridity, as in classical postcolonial theory, and postcolonial ambivalence, but differs in its mechanism. Instead of focusing on shared characteristics or syncretisms, it emphasizes mutual symbolic and political influence. Ambicoloniality presents a key point of divergence from already existing models, as the mutual impact of the two countries over centuries has gone both ways. In contrast to many other empires that established their colonial power relations at a distance. So while the ambivalence informed this notion of ambicoloniality with this prefix ambi, there is also the part of coloniality, which is derived from the work of decolonial scholars. Ambicoloniality is a concept that builds on the notion of coloniality, originally developed by Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, which describes the ongoing legacy of colonialism in the present and demonstrates how colonial power structures and hierarchies continue to shape social relations and cultural practices. The model of ambicoloniality emerges as an alternative to the coloniality-decoloniality dichotomy, which I propose to apply to the particular conditions of the Ukrainian-Russian entanglement, and which can be expanded to further sets of relationships in former Russia's colonies, particularly in the post-Soviet space. And I believe that ambicolonial method can be also of use to the colleagues working with not only with the Soviet and post-Soviet topics, but also in a wider picture, speaking about different cases within Eastern Europe and beyond, where the necessary conditions of cultural proximity, geographic proximity, and what I call also polymorphous coloniality, and I will discuss it now in the presentation, come into that where all these three necessary conditions are fulfilled. So we can speak about applying this model to other cases of this symbolic exchange and where colonial desire unfolds into in the neo-colonial conditions. So the idea is that in an ambicolonial system, the colonizer is not fully in control. The colonized, even under threat, exerts symbolic power. Well, the power structure is twofold, as it is formed through political ambitions and symbolism at play. The agency is delegated from the current or former colonizer to the current or former colonized. Ukraine, in this case, takes an important role in epistemological production that has had a historical impact on Russia's development. So I'm speaking about polymorphous coloniality. Before this, I would like just to show in an illustrative way, because I don't have time to speak about it. But these are the case studies that I address precisely in order to connect my theoretical statements with particular examples from Ukrainian culture, not only contemporary, but also throughout the 20th century. And the polymorphous coloniality is another important term that's important for my for this model that I introduced. Russia's polymorphous coloniality, together with cultural proximity, creates the ambicolonial situation I discussed. Centuries of dissatisfaction with its place in world power hierarchies led Russia to develop a mimicry mechanism. First, it borrows from Cold War narratives of Soviet presumed anti-imperialist resistance. In its propaganda, it imitates anti-colonial struggle and invents a sense of victimhood as a geopolitical other. Ukraine in this Russian picture is framed as part of the global West, while also seen by Russia as its own imaginary West. This gives Ukraine a central role in Russia's worldview, reflecting outdated binary oppositions that emerged long before the fall of the Iron Curtain. The second strand of polymorphous coloniality is the effective relationship between Russia and Ukraine shaped by centuries of struggle. Ukraine is seen as a brotherly nation, another yet the same. The colonizer blindness to Ukraine's intrinsic differences produces a form of self-othering, projecting the essential traits of the oppressed onto the oppressor. The development of Russian neocolonialism, camouflaged by the 1990s democratic processes in entire post-Soviet space, in its ambition of both othering and self-othering through oppression, echoes Achille Mbembe's notion of necropolitics as the dark side of a post-colonial system mimicking colonial rule in its aims and methods. Mbembe points out the particular rhetorical inversion of such politics aimed at mortifying through othering, quoting, "Through a strange transmutation, victims are now summoned to bear, in addition to the prejudice suffered, the guilt that their executioners ought to feel." End of the quote. In Mbembe's model, where the blame is put on the victims, they replicate violence by returning it to the perpetrators through a never-ending cycle. And this is something that also echoes Frantz Fanon's view of how anti-colonial resistance develops. The creation of such a vicious circle of returning violence is beneficial for the colonial ambition of Russia. Yet Ukraine's only option for ceasing the war violence is contributing to the unveiling of Russia's discursive polymorphism and establishing a decolonial status quo of who true victims and who true aggressors are, which is a turn to epistemic justice. So these are more illustrations that are related to the topic of the colonial desire, and this is something that I'm going to talk further. In an ambicolonial relationship, the colonizer is fascinated by the symbolic field of the subaltern country and desires its appropriation. Unlike traditional colonization, this desire is deeply affective. Cultural, political, and social adherence to the other great states' customs is driven by emotional attachment. The neocolonial war of Russia against Ukraine shows a profound connection between the colonial affection and the Lacanian interpretation of jouissance, where the desire receives destructive and deadly effects both on its colonial subject and object. The more the colonizer desires to possess, the more it destroys the object of its desire, and itself together with this object. These affective dynamics render Ukraine the main subject of colonial desire. Russian public imagination is overwhelmed by propaganda claiming Ukraine as a part of its symbolic territory, while Russia's desire is presently toward Ukraine. At the same time, in Ukraine, while the country is forced into resistance, the cultural and social conditions are for at least a decade pointing to the existence of a strong independent culture that resists this colonial situation through the production of agency. Searching for an imaginary sense of reunification, the neocolonial aspiration of Russia transgresses, splits, and eventually destroys the object of longing, which is nevertheless a utopian object, and loses its own integrity in chasing this fantasy of the past. The fatal desire creates a new order of things where the object of desire is unattainable, and this impossibility creates a new power hierarchy that breaks up with the mutuality of exchange. And finally, about ambicolonial structure, and I will conclude already the theoretical part. Oh, I'm sorry. The idea of ambicoloniality in a way deviates from the notion of coloniality of power because it doesn't consider colonialism as a product of inequality of economic and political positions, and the initial difference in ethnic and nation-based rigid hierarchies of power, including subject-object relationships. Rather, it sees power as a symbolic exchange rooted in the cultural strengths of the parties involved. The border between Ukraine and Russia is therefore not just a line on the map, it is a filter of influence, ideas, and desire. This book proposes that ambicoloniality is constituted by four interconnected yet autonomous processes: filtering, appropriation, affection, and transgression. In the conditions of ambicoloniality, the filtering of mutual influences occurs through the borderline, which is uneven and permeable, allowing an exchange of visions and expressions of power. The shared border between Ukraine and Russia presents such a filter that, under normal circumstances, works both ways and shapes epistemologies adjacent to the divisive and mergent line. In an ambicolonial structure, the boundaries of the self and the other collapse. The oppressor internalizes the victim shapes the consciousness of the oppressor. The war is thus not merely fought on the battlefield, but in the very structure of Russia's fantasy of the neocolonial empire itself. The dependency on the double-sided relationship is crucial for the imaginary balance where the two countries stand as two geopolitical pillars. Once the oppressed is emancipated, as happens with Ukraine's decolonial release, that I discuss in detail in the last chapter of my book, the oppressor falls under the weight of the demolition structure of power. This failure represents the ultimate loss of not only territories, but also of the predatory and manipulative cultural system supporting such an entanglement. The aggressive war of Russia aims to maintain this imaginary balance, substituting power, sustaining the epicolonial system with violence. And here I return to the beginning of my presentation that speaks about powerlessness and the void created by powerlessness. However, what escapes the attention of Russia is that the opposite pillar supporting colonialism became decrepit long ago. Ukraine has undergone several rites of passage in constituting a separate identity, from three Maidan revolutions in 1990, 2004, and 2014, to the proven ability of active resistance through the military frontline and the decolonization of the cultural guild. And I will stop here. Just I will show also these wonderful illustrations by the works by Vlada Ralko and Danila Movchan, which I use respectively in the chapter about Euromaidan, the Kiev Diary series by Vlada Ralko, and the work of Danila Movchan is the one that is discussed in the chapter dedicated to war. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments.
Hey, thank you so much. Now let's turn to Mykola Rabchuk for his comments, and then we'll turn to Oksana Yakushko before opening it up for some discussion if we have time, please. Mykola, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Svetlana, for your presentation. The sound was interrupted, so I'm not sure whether it was a problem with my internet or yours. I hope my talk wouldn't be interrupted. If it happens, just let me know. Just say something on the screen. Sorry for that. Things happen. Okay, first of all, I, I'm very glad, I'm happy that this book was written and published because it introduces very firmly, very boldly Ukrainian topics into this field, very controversial field of post-colonial studies. Ukraine was not overrepresented there yet, so it's really great news, and I really appreciate this book. It was very erudite, very well written, has a lot of observations. At the same time, of course, I have some caveats, and I believe that this book should be published both in Ukrainian and many other languages. So I hope my my comments would help in a way, at least to discuss, to rethink some issues. So first of all, I have big problem with this Lacanian and Foucaultian language, which is for me, it's created more for artificial intelligence than for human beings. So it might be my personal problem. So I don't blame you in any way. But still, I'm very hesitant to read this explanation of some abstract categories by other abstract categories, and these abstract categories multiply, and ultimately it's very difficult to figure out what the story is about. I just can give you several examples when you write for example, I propose internal hybridity, which comes as a result of the colonial release and fills the voids when postcolonial hybridity is dissolved, is the solution for regaining soundness and dimensionality. What soundness and dimensionality means here is, you have to think twice before you figure out what the story is about. Or postcoloniality can only be achieved through the visibility of national culture that envelops this position and absorbs the difference and ambivalence pursued by the postcolonial condition. So again, how it absorbs. So there's a lot of things which should maybe it's my polytechnical background. I was educated as a electric engineer, my first education from hard sciences, but still I have problem with this terminology. And more generally, you don't define at the very beginning of the book, you do not define clearly the terminology, what colonialism is, what colonialism specifically related to Ukraine is, what postcolonialism means, what decoloniality means, and so on. You try to define it, but you usually do it with some verbs. You do not say what it is, but what it is doing. Like mm, uh, the postcolonial denotes the situation immediately following the colonial experience and the colonial struggle. So postcolonial denotes. So we have to figure out what, well, it denotes, but what it is, it's not stated out. And the same with the colonial, it refers to the final process of dismantling the colonial narratives. Again, it's okay, it refers to something, but what it is, I prefer to get clearly what it is, what it is missing, unfortunately. So that's one problem. And of course, the same is the coloniality, but it's even more complicated issue. So maybe I would refer to it later. And now, my second problem with the book is that you you refer to the notion of decolonization of the colonial, and you define it here as a about the ultimate objective of decoloniality is complete liberation from any resentment or affect towards the colonial past. In other words, decoloniality fully unfolds through indifference and the erasure of affect as its necessary condition. But how it relates to today in Ukraine? Ukraine is not pursuing decoloniality today. The colonial process is it fights anti-colonial war, and we are not in position now today or in the foreseeable future to completely liberate from any resentment or affect towards the colonial past. So far, it's very hot and it's very dominant in Ukraine's consciousness. So it's another problem. To what degree this term is applicable to specifically to today's Ukraine. Generally, decoloniality, as I understand it, refers to it's kind of rebellion against Eurocentric knowledge about its alleged universality. And Ukrainians don't have much problems with this. Well, they have problems with this, but only to a degree to which this knowledge, this Eurocentric knowledge, is influenced by Russian imperial knowledge, because in many cases it just replicates Russian imperial knowledge, especially in regard of Ukraine. So in this sense, we have a problem, but otherwise it's not a big deal. At least we have little to do with this, decolonial rhetoric which was promoted by South American intellectuals, leftist intellectuals. One of them, you quote, Walter Mignolo, wrote not long ago, quote, "Russia and China are not attacking the world order, but merely defending themselves from the harassment of Western designs." Well, so it is needed to bomb Ukraine. Yeah? Russia bombs Ukraine. Russia destroys Ukraine because it defends itself from the harassment of Western designs. It's perfect, Basically, frankly speaking, I hate this so-called intellectuals. It's absolutely immoral rhetoric, or just stupid. I don't know what is better, what is worse, to be stupid or to be immoral in this situation. And finally, my final point is about notion of decoloniality. I have problem with this because I understand your attempt to go beyond this opposition of colonial, anti-colonial, post-colonial, and to point out at mutual dependence between colonizer and colonized. In a sense, yes, it's correct, and it's a very interesting approach. But I wonder to what degree Ukraine has reciprocal or mutual impact on Russia in this regard. Because from my point of view, colonialism is primarily about dominance and about agency. Colonial power deprives colonized of agency. So Russia obviously tries to deprive Ukraine, deny Ukraine's agency, but Ukraine cannot do this. That's the point. Ukraine doesn't have any resources, any capacity to influence Russia in any similar way. I understand what you mean. You argue that Russia is obsessed with Ukraine, and this obsession makes it in a way dependent on its own imagination, and you call it self-colonization. But my reservation is about to what degree this Ukraine, which is Russian object of desire and which is allegedly agent of influence, is really Ukraine. Because in the case of Russia, this obsession can be defined as sort of paranoia. They created absolutely artificial image of Ukraine, which has nothing to do with real Ukraine. Let me bring here very short and very graphic quotation from Alexander Dugin. I like it very much because it discloses this ambiguity of real Ukraine and imaginary Ukraine in Russian consciousness. Shortly after after Russian invasion in Donbass in 2014, when suddenly Dugin and his fellows noticed that Ukrainians are not going to give up and not going to embrace Russians with flowers. He wrote hysterically in his Facebook, not Facebook, he wrote it in Vkontakte, that, quote, we should clean up Ukraine from the idiots. The genocide of these cretins is due and inevitable. I can't believe these are Ukrainians. Ukrainians are wonderful Slavonic people. And this is a race of bastards that emerged from the sewer manholes. So, this is this wonderful dialectics between Ukrainians as wonderful Slavonic people, which exist in Russian imagination, and real Ukrainians who are, race of bastards who are not true Ukrainians. They cannot believe they are Ukrainians. And what is the net result of this dialectics? Ukraine, real Ukraine, imaginary Ukraine can be considered as an agent having some sort of agency which may influence Ukraine, but it doesn't influence Ukraine. It's stable. It's imaginary object existing in Russian collective consciousness. And yes, of course, it has very negative impact on Russian behavior, but real Ukraine exists in a parallel world. It exists separately, and it has virtually no impact on this, behavior of Russia in parallel world. Just because, whatever real Ukraine does, Moscow doesn't care. They have their own image. They know perfectly that Ukraine is Nazis, that Ukraine is, Banderit, Ukraine is non-existent, and something like this. And whatever Ukraine says, whatever Ukraine does, it doesn't matter. So Ukraine's agency has no impact on Russian behavior, on Russian thought. Imaginary Ukraine has this impact, but it's imaginary. It exists only in Russian consciousness to a degree to which it imagined. So for me, it's a problem whether we can consider this. We can speak about some interdependence in a way. But can it be called self-colonization, or maybe just self-deception, self-mutilation, stultification, maybe in the case of Russia? I'm not sure, because Russia is dependent not on Ukraine, but on its own image of Ukraine, which is actually product of imperial fantasy. So I will stop here. Maybe Oksana, who is a professional psychologist, psychiatrist, would be able to go deeper into this, Lacanian language. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So Oksana, the floor is yours. Oksana Yakushko, professor of psychology at George Washington University.
Yes, thank you, Dякую. Unlike Pani Mykola, I did have Pani Svetlana, my inner Lacanian came forefront, and I, really enjoyed being kind of in the mindset of thinking about some of these concepts that you presented. I also found the book just it kind of stirred my own kind of greater kind of capacity to think, because traversing especially Western anti-colonial, post-colonial literature has been really difficult in terms of understanding Ukraine and where its absence is, and the kind of reactions that I encounter in these spaces towards Ukraine. I just, been really problematic, and at times turned me off from even interacting with that community and then those writers. So I'm so glad you're entering that field and having dialogues and discussion, and I'm really grateful. I very much appreciate the inclusion of art and examples. I think that kind of interplay between really complex ideas and illustration through very affectively rich art was very moving to me. And so that was a really beautiful for me combination. So I appreciated that. A couple of things I wanted to mention and ask to kind of what you think, or maybe the audience thinks. I was thinking in terms of, kind of Russia is centuries old. Delusions of grandeur that is, one born into, so that kind of, imaginary in Lacanian terms that turns into symbolic and signifiers, which kind of have to expel any kind of badness or evilness into someone, right? And so how, and then, how they construct the kind of the real, right? And so I'm interested in like thinking about how in your model, the way I read it, that the assimilation and erasure through violence were kind of the two main pathway of that kind of, in your model. And what I was thinking is how Russia, and maybe others like Sinan would say, requires Ukraine in some ways to continue to exist and to occupy that Russian imagine like, right, to signify that who are the Nazis, so who are the people of pogroms, that it just seems like it emerges Ukraine for them. So Atkin, who you come, and I would love more critiques of Atkin's work, but I read his works on psychoanalysis, and everything is Russian psychoanalysis, even though it's also Ukrainian and Georgian and so forth and so on. So every place is Russia. Odessa is Russia. If it's pogrom, it's Ukraine. So Ukraine appears very specifically, and then Atkins sticks into pogroms or so forth as Ukrainian in a lot of his writing. So I think for Atkins, right, when Ukraine and others appear, I also think right now, okay, the wars in Chechnya, the uses of ethnic minorities in Russia. Russia is considered, right, everything is Russian. It's erased. It's Russia, it's Kremlin, it's Putin. And good Russians on NPR, when they bring out the kind of signifier of like, well, we're good Russians, but it's these minorities in Russia. So they need to, right, revive them as terrorists, as the ones committing crimes in Ukraine. So who cares for Russia that? So I'm just interested in how there's a requirement in, those signifiers of these, colonized nations to exist and actually persist, that they can't fully erase, because they have to have a place to hold. We have to hold their violence and and so forth. So the other thing I wanted to think with you is I have such a struggle with both past and present days. We would call, for me it's more interesting, like leftist intellectuals, decolonial intellectuals that are so committed to promoting these very colonial, violent kind of, so what they write and what they think about, from, for example, Dubois, who was avowed Stalinist, supported Hitler. How does one think of double consciousness and appreciate those kind of theories, and then bring into it a real comfort with extreme forms of violence, and how that exists also. I was thinking about how people here is a signifier for them. Often comes like Vietnam War, and something like, so it occupies, and the West is the only evil, which just, of course, is a signifier that Russia likes to exploit, as you write. So I'm just also trying to think about how in their worldview, they cannot be other evils. They cannot be other colonial, right? So it's organized very much along kind of one continuum. So I just would, I would love to others to think about these things and kind of trying to see how your model or maybe further development of these things can help navigate these, kind of dynamics and polarities. So again, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, both discussants, for great comments. We have about 12 minutes left, so let's turn back to the author. So for your responses, further reflections, and then if we have time, we'll take some questions from the chat if you care to post them, anyone out there. So please.
Thank you, Pani Oksana, for the kind words about the book, and thank you, Pani Mykola, for the critique which is well received and is thought-provoking. And I took some notes, and I will try to respond really briefly to comments of the discussants. So the first comment was about the Lacanian language, and the way how I define the notions, both those that I employ from post-colonial theory and decolonial theory, and those that I propose myself, such as, for example, internal hybridity or decolonial release. Those are the terms that I am proposing as part of this theoretical method within ambicoloniality concept. So my research is informed by post-colonial theory and decolonial theory exactly for that reason, that I feel that neither of two completely describes the particular Ukrainian case and the case of Russian colonialism in Ukraine. In the case of post-colonial theory, we can think about a large concentration on the topic of a distant conquest, a conquest over a large geographical distance, which implies the fusion of two cultures that are very different in their essence. And then all these notions of post-colonial hybridity and post-colonial ambivalence, and those notions that are produced, they can be classified into such as syncretism, creolization, mestizaje, for example. They are built upon this idea that there is this intrinsic, very profound difference that is always contested within these divisions and within these fusions. And in the case of decolonial theory, also there is this presence of geographic distancing, which is not the case in Ukraine, and which is not the case of discussing cultural proximity. But what is the main point of critique that could be used for applying decolonial theory towards Ukraine is the profound Eurocentrism of decolonial scholars. They always place colonialism in Europe. So Europe is always the center of this colonial domination, and other countries, they become subaltern countries in this very rigid structure of coloniality of power. And this is something that also creates a problem that Pan Mykola mentioned with, for example, with scholars like Walter Mignolo, who built his theoretical structure on the model that is based on the first of all is informed by the Cold War divisions and the attempts of Latin American scholars to take sides in this particular world picture. And also it is built precisely with this view of profound Eurocentricity of colonialism. And that is why this lack of understanding of Ukraine's situation by several of the colonial scholars, not all of them, but several of them emerges. And that's why we see this explicit and quite impressive cases of support to Russia as an aggressor from their side. So this is something that my book tried to overcome by proposing a new theory, a new model that would use the constructive material from both frameworks, but build upon them in order to cover the gaps of description, particularly in speaking about Ukraine. And that is why this book is one of the first to discuss cultural proximity and geographic proximity at these depths. And particularly, it is important also to focus on this particular Russian polymorphism. And this is something that also was mentioned during the discussion, that Ukraine, that Russia views as its counterpart, is not real Ukraine. And this is something that I precisely highlighted in my presentation, that Russia built this utopian object that it tries to dominate. But because it is profoundly utopian, it is impossible to make a conquest of this object. And that is why I consider the Russia's polymorphous coloniality a very important element to consider in the ambicolonial model. Now, to the notion of decoloniality and the anti-colonial resistance. My position is that the development of Ukraine after the independence has passed several stages. First, there was the stage of colonialism represented by the Soviet Union. Then, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the anti-colonial resistance and anti-colonial expression came into play. And this was this brief moment in the early 90s when it was the most prominent way of expression and of building of culture and society that is kind of enveloped by this culture. Then the post-colonial condition emerged out of this anti-colonial expression, which was described by Marco Pavlyushin as a mirror image of colonialism, that because of precise ways of addressing different things that it borrows from colonialism, the ways of viewing the world and the ways of opposing. So post-colonial condition is something that builds upon anti-colonial expression, but it is also a recombination, rethinking, revision of the traumatic elements of the past with the aim of placing them constructively within the present. And this was an extended stage in Ukraine, which I propose began to change, experienced a profound shift in 2014 with first Euromaidan and then with the beginning of Russian war against Ukraine, and the necessity to first to comprehend this agency and new knowledge that came into production, and second with all the mobility of all the displacement, or forced displacement, with all the movement inside Ukraine caused by the war. When, for example, speaking about art, for example, many artists, they needed to flee Crimea, they needed to flee the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. They arrived in different other cultural centers of cultural production within Ukrainian territory, and they began representing the situation occurring in the south and in the east to the rest of Ukrainian society. And that's how the documentation became very important after 2014. And this documentation, it constitutes a new knowledge and the new epistemology of the history that is not anymore the history like retrospective history that we are looking backwards at. And it is a history that is unfolding in front of us, and we are witnesses of this history. And this, as I propose in this text, but also in many of my other texts, is something that constitutes precisely the decolonial situation. When there is this particular detachment from one's traumatizing topics, and looking at the history that is equally traumatizing, but that produces some new knowledge that is already detached from the field of knowledge production of and cultural production of the colonizer or the former colonizer. And by the neo-colonial war, Russia is trying to return from this situation towards the post-colonial condition in which the Russia still by itself persists. And about how is possible to that the two expressions coexist with the onset of the war. Of course, the anti-colonial resistance at the front line was reflected in what I consider a paradoxical situation of anti-colonial expression, kind of anachronic anti-colonial expression in culture, something that should have been over already in the early 90s, but returned because of this completely abnormal situation of the war and war violence and the necessity to resist it. So as I said, we look at quite particular situation of both formed by Ukrainian historical coexistence with its perpetual colonizer and the current ongoing condition of the violent war. And this is something that my book tried to cover and tried to explain in detail. So, and to the comment of Pani Oksana, how Yes, continuing my thought, I think it would be good. I think I partly already reflected on this topic, but precisely this structure, it helps explaining how coexistence with these extreme forms of violence is present, and how the status quo is of who the aggressor is and who the victim is in this war is established through some kind of detached observation and through the turn to epistemic to the searches for epistemic justice. And yes, and as for my ambicolonial model, I just wanted to highlight that in this chronology of colonial, anti-colonial, post-colonial, and decolonial, ambicolonial covers all of these stages, because it rather than being a particular stage with its own dynamics, it encompasses the general dynamics of exchange and cultural impact and symbolic impact via the shared border, because geographic proximity is something that unfortunately doesn't change with the time, and it always persists. Just it changes depending on particular phase, changes particular dynamics and particular movement. So this is more or less the model that I presented, and I tried not to define precisely clearly kind of establishing very clear definitions of all the all the notions that I use, because I think that it is good to leave an open ending of the book, first of all, so that this model can be taken by other scholars and used in other case studies that they're experts in, maybe with other regions, and that also I aim not to be prescriptive, but rather that this terminology helps to develop a variety of new perspectives on the questions of colonialism and decoloniality and anti-colonial resistance. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. So I was perfectly on time. As with any kind of book discussion, it's impossible to do justice to it in just an hour. So encourage people to find the book, take a look for it. If you just look up Ambicoloniality, it will come up at the top of your Google search. Just want to once again thank our discussants for leading us off on a great discussion of the book. And of course, most of all, thanks to Svetlana for producing the book and in providing us the opportunity to discuss it. So best of luck with the discussion and the exchanges that it sparks in the future. And we look forward to having further conversations on this in the future, on this important topic. So thank you.